George.
Thank you, Stephen. Talk to you next Monday. Stephen's reports always here on a Monday night, and he gives us great things. Bring your telescopes out every time he talks. Up next, attorney Jonathan Emord joins us as we talk about issues that affect all of us: shock therapy, psychotic drugs, the right to try, GMOs, vaccines, and more, with your calls later on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you with our special guest for the next couple hours, Jonathan Emord, principal of Emord and Associates, practicing constitutional and administrative law in Washington, D.C., before federal agencies. He's the only attorney in history that has defeated the FDA 7 times in federal court and 6 times on First Amendment grounds. Emord began his legal career as an attorney in the Mass Media Bureau of the Federal Communications Commission, and we're going to talk about a lot of issues. And Jonathan, first of all, welcome back, my friend. Always good to have you.
Great to be with you, George.
This story in Jacksonville, Florida, that just broke over the weekend, where this young man went crazy and killed 2 people and wounded 11 and then killed himself at a video game tournament. And apparently, here we go, he was under psychiatric care and was prescribed antipsychotic medicine. There we go.
Well, it's just the story of the day, isn't it? That over and over again, with school shootings and other violent acts all across the country, we find this association, which is never explored by the federal government, never explored by the state governments, between psychiatric drugs and increased violent behavior in youth. Yet it was known and well established many years ago by Dr. Andrew Mossholder at the FDA. It was suppressed. He was ostracized, and only years later did they finally put a black box warning on these drugs. But that association is not being investigated, and we have pushed for that to no avail. We've sued state governments to try to get this information released, that is the medical information, specifically the records showing the prescription and behavior of people who have committed these acts, and they have suppressed that information right and left. It's an amazing story of big pharma prevailing over the public and its right to know.
Now, you're calling for a federal investigation into this link between these psychotic drugs and school violence, aren't you?
Yes, I am. 1 in 5 Americans take these drugs, George. 1 in 5. And the government admits in its black box warning that antidepressants increase the risk compared to placebo of suicidal thinking and behavior in children, adolescents, and young adults. And that association is recognized. Well, if you recognize that association, wouldn't you think that as a percentage of those who are committing these acts must, in some respect, who are on these drugs, be influenced by these drugs to produce their actions? I mean, if it's a catalyst in one way or another, we ought to know. In England, they ban it in youth, and I think it's probably a very good idea. Why don't we do that?
That's a good point. Now, what does the FDA say about all this?
Well, the FDA says, as they always do, that the ultimate causation isn't shown, that while they have agreed finally with their own medical reviewer that there is an association, that psychiatrists can monitor this, and if the child shows that it's exhibiting violent behavior, they can reduce the dose or take them off the drug. But the fact of the matter is these drugs are given out with such liberality in our country that kids go on for years and years on these drugs, sometimes for the rest of their lives, and monitoring their behavior just isn't what we do. We don't do that in the schools. We don't do that with psychiatrists. We don't do that with the police. They don't have the resources available to do it. We simply have to take a look, a very hard look, at this association. If it's a catalyst, and I believe it probably is, in even a small percentage of these cases, we ought to be curbing it to help reduce that, and we ought to undertake some serious measures to prevent the use of these drugs by kids. It shouldn't be prescribed to kids. I just don't. There's a strong evidence that it produces very little positive effects, and the adverse effects of these drugs are pretty profound.
I'm not even sure these drugs work for adults, Jonathan. What do you think?
Well, the evidence isn't there. The extent to which these drugs exceed a placebo effect has not been established in almost all cases. The FDA has approved them without any proof of true efficacy, and as a result, it's just a shot in the dark. And unfortunately, it ends up being a shot in the dark with kids going against the public. It really is a situation where we have got to get a hold on this. Why is it that only with the massive rise in the prescription of these drugs in kids has there been a concomitant rise in the incidence of violent behavior? I'm not saying it's the only cause. I'm not saying it's even a primary cause. But I think there is a link, and I think that link may be the tipping point in many cases.
But it could be the primary cause because it is highly unusual. I don't believe in coincidences that most of these mass shootings that are done by younger people, most of them, these kids have been or were on these drugs.
Right, and the FDA, even the FDA, the FDA suppressed this information. Even the FDA says in its warning on this, patients of all ages who are started on antidepressant therapy should be monitored appropriately and observed closely for clinical worsening, suicidality, or unusual changes in behavior. Let's face it, these drugs like Prozac and Zoloft and fluvoxamine, these drugs are associated with alterations necessarily, that's what they're for, alterations in mental behavior. Those alterations in mental behavior include causing individuals to experience thoughts of suicidality. Well, if they're thinking about killing themselves and they're thinking about violence, isn't that enough for us to say, hey, look, why is it that 98% of the kids who commit these school shootings were on these drugs? Why is it that almost every time we see a school shooting incident or a shooting incident that involves youth, we see that they're on these drugs?
And why is it that most of them seem to kill themselves after the event?
Yes. Suicidality is common in each of these circumstances. Why is it? And we recognize, there's this strong scientific evidence associating these drugs that forced FDA into putting a black box warning on the drugs and telling us that these kids need to be monitored. Well, in point of fact, they're not being monitored. These drugs are being given out with such liberality, and they write the prescription, they give them the drugs, and they're done. They see so many patients, they're writing these prescriptions. A lot of kids in the United States are on these drugs, a lot of them. It's not uncommon to see nurses' stations in public schools doling out these drugs to the kids who have been given these prescriptions. Teachers even will argue to you, hey, look, disruptive behavior, ADHD, ADD, I couldn't control my class unless half of them were drugged.
Can't these kids be treated with supplements, natural supplements that would increase their oxytocin and things like that?
Well, of course. I mean, there are many dietary changes. There's supplements that can be taken. There's exercise. I mean, a lot of this stuff, a lot of our society has changed. I mean, most people don't allow their kids to go roaming about, running outside like we did when we were kids and playing baseball and football outside all day long. This doesn't happen anymore. Parents are rightfully concerned about the safety of their children, but our society has changed so that kids are sitting there in front of a video box and, they're looking at their various devices. And they're not as physically active, and they're not as interactive with other kids and other people, and this leads to a higher degree of introspection. Well, add to that drugs that increase your sense of worthlessness, cause you to increase your view of suicide or thoughts of suicide. I mean, we've got a troubled environment that we're pouring gasoline on the fire, and we're not even asking ourselves about the gasoline. The government is standing foursquare against this. The FDA won't do an investigation, and Lord knows if they did, they would come to the wrong conclusion. The Congress of the United States isn't investigating. The state legislatures are not investigating. This association is real. This is something that we've got to get a handle on, and I don't think until we do we're going to see any serious changes in the incidence of violence by youth in this country.
John, our resident guest and psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Bregan, who has written a book called The Medication Madness, would stand with you on this because he's in shock at the overprescribing of these drugs.
Oh, it's crazy. You know, when you think about it, 1 in 5 Americans are on these drugs. When you think about it, the prescription for these drugs will go for everything from insomnia to mild depression to serious depression to weight loss. I mean, doctors are prescribing these drugs right and left. You go into the doctor and you say that I'm disoriented. They'll say, well, why don't you try some Zoloft? I mean, we have got we talk about an opioid epidemic, but let's take a look at this. This is an epidemic. We've got America on psych drugs. And when you're talking about a youngster who's already emotionally challenged and developing into teenage years and so forth, and you add on this stuff, and then you've got a diagnosis that there's something mentally wrong with the child, then you're giving them these drugs, and it's not that hard to get a diagnosis. Another thing is, one of the most commonly but admitted by its own profession, one of the most commonly misdiagnosed conditions is mental illness in youth.
That sure is. John, stay with us. We're going to come back and talk more about you petitioning the FDA with regards to shock therapy. We'll talk about that, GMOs and vaccines, and much more on Coast to Coast AM. Well, as I was telling you, we just came back from Asheville, North Carolina. Had a fun, great event there, and looking forward to being there back in a couple more years. But I'll be announcing in another couple months the schedule for 2019, and we'll be going all over the map. As a matter of fact, talking about the map, September 15th, I'll be in Scottsdale, Arizona at the Afterlife Symposium. Full information at coasttocoastam.com under events. Just click it at the top of the homepage. If you live in that greater area, I'd love to have you come out there. I'll be hosting a panel with Rosemary Ellen Guiley, Mark Anthony, Walter Semke, Susan Wilson, Scott Milligan, and so many other people. So come on out and look forward to that. That's going to be Saturday, September 15th in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's called the Afterlife Symposium. Welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Jonathan Emord with us. We'll take calls next hour. Jonathan, you are recently petitioning the FDA on behalf of electroconvulsive therapy patients. First of all, tell us what that is, why you're doing this.
Electroconvulsive therapy is an intense electrical current that is imparted to both temples, introducing a grand mal seizure. 70 to 460 volts of electricity put right through your temples into your brain. This is used by the psychiatric community for severe mental illness and drug-resistant mental illness, such as depression, bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, and catatonia. And there is no scientific proof of the long-term safety and efficacy of this device called an electroconvulsive therapy device.
And this has been going on for how many years?
Since 1934.
Jeez. And they have turned some people into vegetables, haven't they?
Yes, they have. About 100,000 people a year are given this therapy, and really it's horrific. The consequences of this therapy leave people, as one of the petitioners in our petition to the FDA said, it robs me of my soul. Kenny is a typical example of a person who went through this therapy in his youth. He was a valedictorian, and he had great promise, and he was suffering from depression, and he went to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said to him that this treatment was safe and that it would alleviate his depression and he could go on with a normal life. And he received roughly 30 different sessions, treatments 70 to 460 volts into his head, and now he has no memory of his high school, no memory of his childhood, no memory of his parents, no memory of his siblings, no memory of any talents that he had. He says he feels vacant and that he suffers from anxiety attacks, and that he has problems with his vision. He has never had the same vision since that time. He has significant problems concentrating. He can't maintain a thought. So what did the medical community do to Kenny? Well, as he says, they robbed me of my soul. And this is, the destruction of a human being.
Oh, my gosh. I mean, they, in many cases, turn these people, like I said, into vegetables. I don't know if that's appropriate to even say that, John, but they come out of this thing blank.
That's right. And what's really horrific about this? We went over to the FDA. We talked with their panels, their scientists. And one of them, after our discussion, they seemed nonplussed by the idea of not doing what they intend to do, which is to take it from a hazardous device, Class 3, and move it to Class 2, which is less hazardous, more available, with just, quote-unquote, special...
So they're going to go the other way.
They're going the other way. They want to make it more available. They want to make it possible so that you can have more devices also, such that you could even have implantable devices that you would use, not just going to a doctor, but you might be able to do this on your own. I mean, it's insane what they're allowing the industry to get away with, and we're trying to stop that with this petition. We're going to sue them if they proceed with the reclassification. There is no evidence of long-term safety and efficacy. It does not meet the medical device standards. This is a grandfathered device, and they're required, before they reclassify it, to get the scientific proof of safety, but they're proceeding with reclassification without it, despite years of demanding it.
Jonathan, who invented this thing?
Well, it actually is an evolution all the way back, believe it or not, to the 17th century, when they would find different ways of imparting what was, unbeknownst to them, electricity into the brain. But modern times, it's the product of a couple of companies. Symantec is one company, and these companies put this device together really without any serious scientific evaluation of efficacy. It is...
Isn't this thing, though, like a little electric chair in that it works on the same principle?
That's right. It really is a case of desperation. You've got someone who's catatonic. You have someone who's severely depressed. The drugs don't work for them. This happens to almost all patients. If they're on them long enough, they declare them to be drug resistant because the drugs just simply don't work on them. And so then they say, well, this is what we can do. And this is what one of the scientists at the FDA told me. He said, look, these people, they're absolutely miserable. Some of them are inconsolable. They cry constantly. You're a doctor. You're looking at that. You want it to stop. So does the patient's relatives. They want it to stop. So one of the things that this does is stops it. Well, yeah, it does. It
and everything else that goes with it.
Right. It just blows their brains away, as you would expect. I mean, if you stick your finger in a light socket, you get the electrical charge that is comparable to what you're getting on both sides of your brain. Do that for 30 minutes, some 30 or 40 times to yourself.
Oh, my God.
See what happens then. I mean, it's just absolutely barbaric in it's not a treatment. It's a dumbing down of a person so that they no longer exhibit characteristics that you find offensive. Doctors are satisfied with it because, hey, look, this person was crying inconsolably. Nothing I could do about that.
Didn't they do this to one of John F. Kennedy's sisters many, many years ago?
They did a lobotomy.
Was it? That's an operation now, right?
Right, and lobotomies are considered, offensive even by the FDA, and they're largely not used. Yet this thing, which is the same thing as it's an electric lobotomy, has gone on and has not been taken out of the medical lexicon. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association encourages its use in resistant cases. And what's so shocking about this, no pun intended, is that the FDA has not compelled this industry as a condition precedent to marketing these products to prove the long-term safety of them. As a result, you've got all these people, 100,000 people a year getting it. And you know what? They don't even have restrictions in some states on the age to be giving it. Children as young as 1 year, even younger than 1 year, have been given this treatment.
No.
Can you believe that?
How would you even know that a little 1-year-old had some kind of mental issue?
You can't. There's some mental issue with the psychiatrist who recommends it.
I would think
it's
so.
Absolutely barbaric. And to do that to a child, and yet in some states like Arizona, for example, there's no minimum age in the law required to give this. In many other states, you can give it without much of a problem. You have to explain yourself. And only in Texas and Colorado do they prohibit it outright for people under the age of 16. But this is an area that really needs focus, because we have got to get this out of here. I mean, this is not a treatment. This is really just being absolutely brutal to people. And we used to talk about how they would take people who were mentally ill. They didn't know what to do with them, so they would warehouse them. Well, warehousing people has become, it still exists, but it's become more difficult to do. People don't like to warehouse people anymore.
And what does that mean, warehousing?
Just throw them in a mental institution for the rest of their lives and sedate them so that they can't basically do anything or think. Or
you make them zombies.
Make them zombies. So instead, they make them zombies with this stuff. And it's not, they'll say, it's tremendous because the person after treatment doesn't exhibit the symptoms. We've cured them. Their symptoms are gone.
They don't do anything. They just sit there.
Well, right. If you hit someone with a sledgehammer and knock the brains out of their head, they'll also not exhibit those symptoms. I mean,
they're really not alive when they do this to somebody, are they?
Well, I think when you think what the consequences of this. Death is one of the side effects that the FDA apparently seems to accept. You can die while you're receiving this. You can have cardiovascular problems are typical, arrhythmias, heart attack, stroke, hypertension, hypotension, prolonged seizures, manic symptoms. You can actually become manic because of this. Chronic pain, physical trauma, and as we talked about, loss of memory, short-term memory gone, long-term memory gone. These are unacceptable. In any culture that values human life, you would not do this. You just can't do this to people. You can't rob them of their soul, as Kenny says. You can't do this.
I'm curious what MRIs look before and after this kind of treatment.
Yes, and the damage that is done with these people. I mean, it is something that you would not wish on your worst enemy, and yet the psychiatric community, you find article after article praising this and saying how great it is. There's one psychiatrist that we interviewed who said that he recommended it for his own father. Now, this is great.
Jeez.
You can argue. It's interesting how people can convince themselves of the merits of something simply based on the surface, the symptomology disappearing. Well, we can do a lot of killing in getting rid of symptoms. I mean, you can kill a person with cancer by giving them chemotherapy, and if you're an injudicious doctor, you will do just that in every case. This is the same type of thing. This isn't curing them of their disorders. This is adding new problems to their underlying problems. They may no longer have apparent depression, but they've got all these other symptoms and a loss of their own. Can you imagine losing your recollection of everything that occurred before you received?
Oh, yeah, your memory just wiped out, erased.
You're released from the hospital, and you're brought back, and you come into a house, and you say, well, who's this? And the person says, well, I'm your husband. And you say, well, who are these? And the person says, these are your children.
Oh, do they even know who they are themselves?
No, they suffer from, many times they have these, as you would expect, these anxiety disorders because they can't figure out who they are. They don't know who they are.
Oh, that's got to be frustrating. Oh, my gosh. So what do you hope to accomplish with the litigation?
Well, we're trying to force FDA to avoid the reclassification from 3 to 2 in the first instance, but our long-term objective is to just get rid of this. I mean, this is not an acceptable alternative. It should not be available for doctors. We shouldn't be witnessing over 100,000 people a year getting this.
What's one of these treatments cost?
Well, a lot of them are involuntary, so the state bears the cost. So you've got people in institutions getting this rather frequently. And then you have the individuals paying for them, and the rates can vary from doctor to doctor. I mean, this is one of those things that is in an unregulated marketplace where people are charged from thousands to tens of thousands of dollars to have their brains mutilated in this way.
John, I want you to assume for a moment you've had this done. I want to talk to you as if you're someone who has had this kind of shock therapy, and I want to hear what you sound like. Do you know enough about? I'm sure you do, to kind of mimic that.
Well, I'll tell you. Any emotion in my voice, let's pretend, isn't there. I would talk to you if I had this repeatedly.
Do you stumble?
And we've seen many people. Some of them stutter. Some of them cannot communicate with you cogently. They cannot maintain a single thought.
They can't put a sentence together.
They can put a sentence together frequently, but they can't put a paragraph together. They can't create a cogent thought. In Kenny's case, for example, he can think about this. He can, if he concentrates, he can tell you what's going on. But he has problems in sharing it in an animated way. He cannot, in other words, there's no soul to what he's saying. He's just talking to you like a vacant person. He knows who he is now. He hasn't had this in a long time. He knows he's been educated. This is what my life was. But it's like a story you've read about somebody else because you don't remember any of it.
He knows what's in his head, but he can't get it out, can he?
Right, that's right. And then, you have a wide range of reactions to this. So some people are hysterical. They get upset when they even try to think about it because they can't. They can't cause their minds to function in a normal way, and it's frustrating to them, and then they go into a state of depression or mania, and they start crying, and this is part of their way of coping. Other people are just vacant. I mean, other people are just, they're there, but they're not there. And then you have other folks who are suicidal, who can't bear living with the fact that they don't know who they are. It's a degree of anxiety that's impossible to fathom. It's so hard for us, not having gone through this, to really fully appreciate what's going on with them. And of course, you can't get into someone's brain and see what's going on. All we have are the external ways they communicate. But without question, you see a huge difference between someone who is, normally functioning and those who have been subjected to this.
I mean, I would guess, and I don't even like to use the word therapy because to me therapy means it works. This apparently does not. But I would guess that they have taken some people who are pretty violent and have done this to them and have just basically lobotomized them electronically, haven't they?
That's right. Yeah. It's a quote-unquote last resort in many instances.
It's a way to quiet these people down, I think.
Yeah. It's just to take offensive behavior and end it. Without
killing the person.
They kill them.
In some cases, they do, but I mean,
yeah, they consider that an acceptable risk. It's just death is an acceptable risk. This person, and what it really is a failure of the entire psychiatric profession to find out what is really wrong with these people and treat that. The drugs don't work. This doesn't work. This just makes them less offensive. It's a last resort. They do it really for society. They're looking at them saying, gee, I can't stand what's going on with this person. They're crying uncontrollably. They're violent. They're in a state of abject depression. How do I deal with that myself? Well, I can't. So what do? I can't give them drugs anymore. That doesn't work. I'm just going to try this electroconvulsive therapy. And you should see the doctors and the nurses who do this and the profession. I mean, they just applaud this. They say, gee, this is
Well, how much do they make? What's it cost?
Well, as I say, it varies from doctor to doctor. The charges for this thing can be thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars. The number of instances when they perform this, they can do this indefinitely. I mean, some people have had hundreds of these done on them.
It's a cash machine. John, we're going to come back. We'll talk more about some issues, and we'll take phone calls next on Coast to Coast AM.